6 months into a project and no one could clearly say what had been completed.
That's not a productivity issue. That's a milestone issue.
I'm Rhonda.
And I'm Bryce. And this is the case of the missing milestones.
Welcome to the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast.
Every week, we take a real case study from professional service engagements and break it down. What was sold, what actually happened in delivery, and the root cause of where things started to go wrong.
And we're not just talking theory here. We show how most projects break down slowly across the agreement, the milestones, the work, and the way it's managed.
So we work the case step by step to understand where it really went wrong and how to fix it.
I'm Rhonda Lee.
And I'm Bryce Holloway.
And this is the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast. Welcome back to the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast. On this episode, we are continuing the discussion of the same case study that we discussed in our last episode, but this time we're talking about all of the missing milestones and the effect that had on the success of the case.
Yeah, and this is a fascinating case, Rhonda, and I think there's a lot here to talk about. For those of you who are joining us maybe for the first time, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss anything. In our previous episode, we went through a bit of this case, the beginning part, how it was sold, the agreement that didn't really exist, or at least nobody knew about except maybe one person. And today we're continuing the discussion because that wasn't the only problem with the case, right? The agreement, that was definitely an issue. There was lack of clarity across the team. Nobody actually knew where the agreement was except one sole individual, including the vendors who were being tasked to do different parts of this system. So that was a huge problem for sure. Make sure you go back and watch that episode and give us your thoughts. But today we're going to continue the discussion and we're going to talk about what happened next. So there was no clear agreement. That's great. What did that translate into as far as things to get done and in the right order?
It was a massive system build that included a new CRM. It included client portals, included multiple vendors to get this done. They had 6 months of activity and minimal output. And then they brought me in and gave me a 3-month deadline. And so one of the first things that I did was and we talked about this last time too, what is it that we're trying to do, but also where are we? And what I discovered was the vendor that was building out the client portals was meeting weekly with the executive project manager at the time.
Okay.
However, there were no milestones. There was just, we need a client portal. No clear defining of what are the objectives, what are the goals, what do we intend to accomplish with these client portals, what is the purpose of these client portals. So the majority of the time was really spent on the visual layout of the dashboard of the client portals. There was no initial instruction. There was just, hey, build out a client portal dashboard and come back and show me what you have.
So I want to jump in and ask a couple questions. There were two vendors, right? And to do different parts of this overall system. And the one we're talking about right now didn't actually understand the full idea of what was supposed to happen, right? There was no agreement that was given to these vendors to say, here's what we would like to have done. Here's what we think it will mean when it is done. And maybe laying out even this is how we communicate and check back and forth, et cetera. So this vendor in particular, the one for the client portals, did a lot of work. You said they were meeting with the project manager regularly, this executive who was the sole proprietor of the overall information or vision for this project. What were they meeting about? Like, how was that going? If there were no specific milestones, which I think is the case here, what was it that they were even trying to accomplish? How did they structure their work? Do you have any insight on that maybe?
Like I was mentioning a minute ago, they were meeting about the visual aspects of the dashboard for the client portal. In the initial agreement, it was build a client portal. It wasn't build a client portal that does XYZ.
Are you saying most of the focus for that prior 6 months was just around the UI of this client
Correct.
portal?
Yes.
How it would look and feel or whatever, not necessarily functionality, or there's general functionality they could probably guess by some of the UI, but
Yeah.
Did they have a realization of what that full scope would be?
They didn't. And that was one of the things that I realized when I was brought onto the project was, yes, they want this dashboard that displays all of this information, but there was no discussion of where are they going to get that information from. All of that information lived in the CRM or was going to live in the new CRM that was in the process of being built simultaneously. And that was where I was really surprised that the two vendors had never spoken, because there's some significant integration that had to be built in order for those to work the way that they wanted and intended.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask, this vendor is working with, presumably working with, or at least communicating with the executive project manager
Yes,
to get an understanding of what things should look like.
correct.
Did they understand that there would be another source of information maybe later to come? Or did they even have that much information to say, hey, where are we getting this info from? And should we talk to those other people? Is there another team? Is there another vendor you're using? Was that even a discussion that was being held that you know of? Or were they just, we're going to do this UI for this, and at some point we're expecting that you'll give us sources of data for this?
I don't know if it was ever explicitly stated, but I assume that it was assumed, right? Like when somebody comes to them and says, "Hey, we need you to build a dashboard to display this information," it has to be assumed that there's going to be a source for that information, especially if they aren't saying, "Hey, we need you to build a dashboard that not only displays this information but captures it." But at the same
Okay.
time, it wasn't explicitly clear, so I don't know that the vendor building out the dashboard was really aware of that. So maybe he didn't know to ask to talk to the other vendor. That's a good point.
Okay. Yeah. So you come into the project after 6 months. You obviously start going in and asking questions. We talked a little
Yeah.
bit about this in the last episode. You start asking, hey, where are you? What things are going? Did you get a sense from either vendor that they had structured what they thought they should be doing in any kind of organized fashion?
Yes, both of them did try to structure the little bit of information that they had, especially the one building the CRM, but it was mostly in Word documents and Excel spreadsheets. Even the mapping for the migration of data from the previous CRM to the new one was all being done in Excel spreadsheets, which created some issues down the road, which we can talk about probably in another podcast. But yeah, they were definitely making attempts to structure it based off of the information that they had. The other thing that is interesting is the dynamic of the team. So the vendors that were brought in, I wasn't part of the decision making of what vendors would be used, because when I was brought on, the vendors were already chosen. So I don't
Right.
know what was used to vet these particular vendors, but I did notice that they were rather young in their careers.
Which doesn't necessarily mean anything in particular. It is interesting. And I want to highlight this because it's easy when you start working cases like this, analyzing cases like this, to say, this is a case where everybody just made horrible mistakes and did
Yeah.
terrible work. That's not the case here. I wanted to ask the question about how did they structure their work, because this is what you will find across the industry. People trying to do good work. People have this desire to do good, valuable work. And so these vendors, it sounds like, were trying that. They were doing that with the information that they had. The problem wasn't that the vendors or the individuals in this case weren't trying to do good work or were just slacking or whatever else. And you won't find that across most of the cases, if not all the cases we talk about on this podcast. The issue was they didn't have clear structure. They weren't given, we need these things, we need this first, then this. And maybe your project executive, being the sole proprietor of the overall vision, didn't really have enough information or knowledge to be able to structure those, which is why, as we talked about last episode, you need to have that clarity across your team.
Yeah.
That's why you have a team. You've hired a team of good people. Let them work together to create this structure to then be able to pass that down the chain, right?
Correct. And the only reason that I bring up the fact that these vendors were rather young in their career is to illustrate the culture and the dynamic of the relationship. I feel to a certain extent they possibly were chosen because they were young and they would be less likely to push back. This particular executive did not appreciate anytime somebody pushed back on anything that they said. Not only did they not appreciate it when people pushed back, this person believed that they had skills and business knowledge that they did not have. And so they weren't coachable. Not only were they not coachable, but they believed they themselves was the ultimate coach, which is
Oh,
always fun.
that's good.
So I do believe that the vendors were definitely trying, but I don't believe they felt safe saying, "Hey, this isn't clear enough." Because I do think they even tried to
Okay.
say, "Hey, can we get a little bit more clarity?" And the response they got was, you just do it. I don't understand what the problem is. Why can't you just do it?
Yeah.
Why are you making it difficult? That kind of thing. And there is, to a certain extent, there is a little bit of culture that's don't wait until things are perfect to start. And I agree with
Sure.
that. I agree with that. You don't have to wait for things to be perfect, but there is a minimum foundation that does need to be in place. And that foundation is, what are we doing and why? What do we want that piece to accomplish? What is the purpose of that? That's the minimum. You have to at least
Yes.
have a purpose. And they didn't have that. And then the dynamic was that they did not feel comfortable enough to push back and get that clarity.
This is one of those things we talked about before where culture can play
Yes.
such a huge role in how these things go, right? If your
Yes.
culture is not a good culture, I'm holding the information here
Mhm.
just with me and you can't ask additional questions because you're questioning me. Your culture really needs to be set up to say, hey, if people need clarity, if they have questions about it, take the time to sit and talk about it. That might feel like, in one case, that you're wasting time, maybe, right? You're
Yeah.
like, I don't know, just get the work done. We need to just work. But what you'll find down the road is if you're not taking the time to have that clarity because your culture is such that people don't get to question me, that's going to
Yeah.
cause nothing but issues down the road. And you're going to waste more money down the road. This is a prime example of that. They spent 6 months spinning wheels, doing something, people trying hard to do good things, but ultimately not really getting anywhere because they didn't have the clarity. They didn't have the structured breakdown of what needed to be done in an organized fashion because of that culture.
Yes. The culture of the organization definitely played a large factor in this case. And part of the reason why it played such a large factor is that the way the case was handled was the culture of the organization. The culture of the organization was, I wouldn't even say you're on a need to know basis. It was on the information this executive wanted you to know, which didn't always amount to all of the information you needed. And this was actually consistent across other projects. It wasn't just specific to this one project. This particular executive was also notorious for going in and having meetings with their leadership team, and the leadership team bringing proposals, various things to them, provides the proposal to them. They look at it, say, that's great, hand the proposal back, and then proceed to forget that the proposal ever happened. And so the next time you have a conversation with this individual, it's as though you never had the previous conversation with them. So there was also a little bit of that dynamic going on as well.
Yeah, that's pretty healthy. That sounds pretty healthy.
And the other thing too, and I know this isn't really what this particular podcast topic is about, but the culture of this organization was so direly unhealthy and toxic. I know that it started to affect the mental health of the people that worked under this person.
Yeah. And I wonder if we need to take an episode here in the next little while and talk about working the culture, right?
Yeah.
I think we probably have as many examples of that as we do of cases that didn't work well.
Yes.
So there were no milestones given or created even by this executive project manager. You talked about how the portal team did visit with the executive project manager on occasion. I assume there was some of that with the other team or not. And then how did they check in progress? How did they say, this is how much we've gotten done? Did they just come
Yeah.
back every so often and say, look what we did? And he would say, no, that's not good, or that's good, or like, how did that work? Do you have a
Yeah.
sense of how that went?
Part of the issue that we had with the CRM build was the executive who vetted out the vendor who made the recommendation of the CRM that we were moving to didn't have a really great understanding of the process that we were trying to fulfill within the CRM. And this happens often when you're interviewing a potential new vendor and you say, okay, I need this. It's really easy for the vendor to say, yep, we can do it. We can do that. We can do that, thinking we'll just figure it out along the way. So there was a little bit of
Yeah.
that. So not only was there not true clarity from the executive project manager to the CRM vendor about what we needed, I think there was some overpromising also coming from the CRM vendor. That became issues when I finally got in. So building the CRM, they had a basic understanding of what fields were needed, which, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but in this particular CRM, it's literally drag and drop. You can build out a very basic CRM in a relatively short period of time.
Okay.
If you know what types of fields that you need, it's a matter of choosing, okay, do I need a text field? Do I need a numerical field? Do I need an email field? Do I need an address field? Do I need a state field? That kind of stuff. You drag and drop it in. And so they were able to build a relatively basic CRM. What they had when I came on was not 6 months worth of work. I don't know what they were doing. And
Right.
if I asked too much, then it became a defensive situation. So I tried to just focus on, okay, moving forward, this is what we're going to do. Because
And
really, I
that's
couldn't
usually,
change anything.
yeah, and that's usually a good approach when you come to a point like that, because people don't like being told that what
Yeah.
they've spent their time on didn't amount to much, and that's not productive, right? And
Yes.
so that's a good approach to say, okay, we are where we are. Let's change
Yeah.
some of the things we have. Let's make this simpler. Let's provide clarity and let's move forward. But to this point, before you came in, without milestones, and it didn't sound like there's a ton of checkpoints in,
No.
how did they figure out what order things needed to be done? Was there any direction given from the management to these vendors about this is what we'd like to see first, then add this functionality, then add this, right? Was there anything like that? And then if not, what was their interaction like? Was it just, ta-da, this is what we have. What do you think? Did they get feedback in any kind of regular cadence?
There was a basic understanding of the modular structure, the hierarchy that needed to be built within the system related to individual clients and family units. So there was a basic understanding, but there was not a clear understanding of how those modules needed to interact with each other. That's where we struggled the most because we had to build some automation for those modules to interact the correct way with each other because it was specific to the business model.
So let me ask too, without this clear structure, there's no phases, right? There was no like, hey, this part needs to get done. After your part, then you need to contact this other vendor, or we'll have a big meeting and we'll talk about integration for the next pieces. There was none of that, right?
Correct.
So let's talk about what that caused as far as like rework and having to do pieces over.
There wasn't a ton of rework necessarily in the CRM because they didn't know enough to even start building the automations.
So they
So,
hadn't done enough stuff to even redo,
yes, correct. They had not done enough work on the CRM to actually even justify or have any need for any rework.
which
So,
sounds crazy, but go ahead.
yeah. The other thing too was there was some sort of budget. Again, I was not privy to what the budget was. I was not privy to how much this vendor's hourly charge was or any of that. But I was told it was costing us a lot of money. The irony was, first of all, they didn't do 6 months of work in those 6 months. I don't know what they're charging you. You were in charge of that part of it. I don't know what you're coming to me to complain about that.
Yeah.
And they were definitely not only looking at the budget, but also worried about having everything complete in time. Like I said, they did try to structure it. However, because they were getting such little information, they would get a little bit of information and then they would just go work on whatever that was. It was almost like they were hungry for information, hungry for direction. And the second they got even the glimpse of direction, they would go out and they would do that really quickly. So it wasn't a productivity issue. They just didn't know what they needed to do. And they also didn't have a great understanding of why were
Yeah.
they doing this because it's this domino effect. What happens at one end of the process affects down the line. And that was one of the things that I was always trying to get people to understand even before we went into this system rebuild, even those who were performing the process. It was what you do at the beginning affects how it ends if you don't start it out correctly. It's the same thing with the execution chain, right? You have
Yeah.
to have a solid foundation. Otherwise, everything trickles down and it's wrong. At times, it felt like I was screaming underwater.
Without having those milestones and without having clarity, the things that milestones give you is some vision of what you're doing, what it affects, which piece it affects, how that overall piece is going to play with the overall system. So you have these phases of this is what we need to get done, and here's why. This is what we're delivering because of this milestone, and that's going to go into here. And then we do this next piece. Without those, you're saying that these vendors were
Yeah.
hungry for any kind of information or clarity about the next thing. And then they would just grab that little piece and run and do something. And
Yes.
so, sure, that could be described as productivity. They were getting something done. They were told we need this, and they were running back to get that done. But without having an understanding of this sequence, without having an understanding of the overall value of the whole system that they're producing, that could cause a lot of problems. If you're creating a piece of something but you don't know how it fits. I'm making the peg. Someone else
Yeah.
is making the space it fits into. How do I know that's actually going to work together and give value in the end? So I could see where you wouldn't necessarily have to redo everything, but eventually you're going to have to rationalize those things together and make it all work. And so when did that come into play? Because that had to happen before you completed this in 3 more months, right?
Once I started getting them talking together and identifying, okay, this information that's going to be displayed in the client portal, it needs to come from this place within the CRM and that kind of stuff, and pushing that out. But there's also a third component to it, and that was our billing portion, and it was PCI compliant. And so that was actually being created, customized on the back end by our banking system. And
Okay.
that was also information that was going to be displayed within the client portal. So it's almost like a triangle, right? The client portal had to connect with the CRM, the billing had to connect with the CRM, and then the client portal also needed to connect with the billing. So there was a lot of information. Some of it was pushing one way, some of it was going back and forth between the systems depending on what the information was. And the PCI compliant portion was actually rather complex. I'm not going to go into it. It was for compliance reasons and based off of the business model of the organization. There was another person who was actually managing the billing portion of it, which is ironic because one of the reasons I was brought onto the project was because I had a similar vision to the executive as to how we would redo the billing. So I helped them build out, design it in the CRM, how the PCI compliant part would plug into there. But what they didn't do was we were probably a couple weeks from launch, and I came in and I said, okay, so where's our refund function? Where's our ability to give prorated refunds? Where's our ability to prorate monthly rates? And the guy that was overseeing that portion was like, he had completely forgotten about that because he hadn't even brought me in on that. That again should have been part of the milestone list. We
Yeah.
need this portion to do X, Y, Z, right?
Yeah.
It's a basic checklist, really, when you think about it. We need the PCI compliant part to do X, Y, Z. We need the CRM to do X, Y, Z. We need the client portal to do X, Y, Z. And then we break down each of the XYZs into, okay, what has to be done in order for us to accomplish that?
If you have those milestones, you get that structure, right? You get that
Mhm.
clarity of what has to happen, also outlining that. And we understand that change will happen over time, right? Maybe new requirements come in, maybe how they need to be done gets changed. If you have things done in milestones, then you get to the thing you're doing, you can start asking more questions and trying to figure out, do we have everything we need? Is there more discussion that needs to happen? Are the requirements the same as when they were initially laid out? Without that, though, things get lost, like you talked about, right? Several pieces of it sounds like critical functionality were simply left out and forgotten about because there was no structured execution. There was no structure around the work that needed to get done. And that clarity was not there for those vendors. So
Absolutely.
in this project, it sounds like this is true, and correct me if I'm wrong, but did they not actually have any way to measure progress along the way?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
And there was no way for them to even know what success looked like. They weren't necessarily stuck. They just had no way to measure their progress. There were no metrics. There was no outline of this is what success looks like. This is what a successful project will be. There was none of that. There was just, we need a new CRM and we need a client portal and we need a billing structure that is PCI compliant and meets other compliance standards.
So the entire measurement of progress was going to be, hey, we're done. Great. It looks like you're done. That's the entirety of their measurement that was set up from the beginning of this project.
Having not been a part of that beginning part, I don't know specifically what it was, but it appears that there was just, we're going to work until we're done. I don't know if you've ever been in one of those positions where you're like, I don't know what it is that I need or want, but I'll know it when I see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel
It,
like this was one of those situations. Like he didn't really know what he wanted. He was really thinking that, okay, these people are professionals. This vendor knows how to build a client portal. Somehow, a lot of times people translate that into they know what components are needed in a client portal, right?
sure.
Which is ironic because it's going to be specific to the nature of the business and the business's
Yeah.
needs. There's not just like this set standard of client portals, right? This template for client portals. The same with the CRM, especially there's like basic standard CRM builds, but that's mostly on the sales side. There's not for a fulfillment. So this was going to be very custom. And so to not have this idea of this is what we need and this is what success looks like in more of a just show me what you have and I'll eventually know when I see it because I don't really know what I need, but I'll know it when I see it kind of thing. And
Yeah.
then he wondered why it took so long.
There is this idea of understanding the art of the possible, right? So sometimes you might want to go to a vendor or a consultant or something and say, we want something. We have an idea of something we need that looks like this. Show me what kinds of things we could do in that general area. There's something to be said for show me what can be done because maybe I don't know. That shouldn't be how you approach actually doing the thing, right? You should come back with the, oh, I like some of that. Okay, now let's sit down and structure the plan, the design, and whatever. And if you have to work with vendors to make the design, structure the plan, that's perfectly fine. But you should have that and then you get started, right?
Correct. And that's where a lot of times people get hung up or they get into trouble. And I think I talked about this in a previous podcast, and you can probably speak to this as well. Oftentimes, I've come into organizations where their IT has actually been their operations department because they think, okay, I need automation, I need these systems to operate. And so, because these people have the skills to build the system and they have the skills to do the coding, the custom coding that usually needs to be done, they automatically assume that translates into they know how to build efficient systems.
Sure.
Which is not always true. Just because you've gone to a class and you've learned how to code doesn't mean you know how to do it efficiently. You just know how to code according to how somebody tells you to code or how you want to code,
Yeah, I code perfectly. But
you
other
know?
people, and I never add stuff that I think is cool and not requirements. That does actually get done. And I think you're right. It does take a bigger team to get these things done effectively. Bringing it back to this particular case, the fact that there were no milestones, is that a vendor issue? Is that a complexity issue? Because as a vendor, as a consultant, if I'm doing work for somebody, I'm going to make sure that I have a structured idea of what has to be done, right? I want to know the phases and the sequences and things like that. And so in this case, the vendors didn't seem to have that. They weren't given that. But it also feels like they didn't reach out and try to grab that and insist on it or demand that. And demand maybe a tough word if you're working with clients, but insist on it, right? And say, no, we need to have this again so we can make the best thing for you, not just because we're trying to question you and all that kind of thing. So was this a vendor issue or do you feel like it was something else?
I think that it was multiple issues. I don't want to speak negatively about people who are earlier in their career, but I do think that there is something to be said about somebody who has a little bit more experience and therefore has more confidence to push back. I'm sure that these vendors walked away from this project with a lot of lessons that they will implement in their future. That's how things work, right? Some of that played into it, but also the culture of the project leader in the beginning, the control of the information, the not allowing pushback, the not allowing clarity, and then the fact that this was a complex process just compounded it, right? If this was a standard CRM and client portal build, then I don't think that we would have seen the issues that we saw. But it was a complex process. Part of the problem was the original project manager was in denial as to how complex it was. They wanted to simplify things, and really what they wanted to do was simplify things for the member on the front end, which doesn't necessarily translate into simplifying things on the back end. So they wanted to say, no, you just do XYZ. And like I said, I was screaming underwater. No, there's more to it. You can't just do XYZ. And that's why we have these issues of what about refunds? What about prorated refunds? What about prorated charges? What about these little details that get lost when you want to oversimplify it? You're in denial as to how complex it actually is.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep things simple. I think that's a general rule people should try to live by, right? But you should also not assume that everything is completely simplified, especially if you're building systems. That doesn't make sense. It's usually if not always, more complex than you initially believe it to be. And you find that out when you start to actually document this kind of structure. As a vendor, you should insist on that kind of structure, but you should also be able to use the right tools to do this. If this structure is kept across lots of different applications or tools, or part of it not even kept with you, that becomes a huge problem because you're not really able to then work off of this commonly shared structure that everybody knows and can analyze, or maybe they all believe in it or whatever. There's a lot of issues that could come from a vendor perspective, right? I would want to make sure that I have all of that in one place that I could see, my whole team can see, and then we can dig in as we get to each piece.
Yeah, and the transparency is key, right? If you're having these closed door meetings individually with these vendors, and it doesn't even have to be intentionally, but the conversations are going to be different. They're going to have different questions. It's going to go a different way. And so each vendor is going to be receiving completely different and sometimes possibly conflicting information, which I do believe happened in this case, especially when this particular project manager couldn't even keep track themselves of what it was that they were telling to other vendors and what it is that they were wanting to do. Transparency is key for clarity, to making sure everybody is on the same page. This whole idea of controlling information, I don't understand it. I understand that there are some things that need to be not public, but this whole idea of keeping information private, it just doesn't work well. And it didn't work well for this situation.
Milestones, they're the execution control system, if you will. They're
Correct.
the things that help us to figure out what needs to be done, in what order. And those can be broken up. There's a lot of things that can go into each milestone, but the milestones are this high level view of here's the phases of the work that needs to get done. And if everybody can see those, and there's that visibility we were talking about, then if you're missing something, you have your whole team or groups of teams that can say, hey, I think there's this thing that goes into this. And that'll naturally happen over time. You may add additional milestones to a bigger project, but if you define them early, the ones you know about, the ones that you can understand, and the team can work those together and say, yeah, this looks like a good plan, or hey, maybe there's this other thing we should put in there, you're going to have way more success down the line.
Correct. And at the very least, when you identify what each component of your projects, you need to have an understanding of, at the very least, a list. We need this part to do XYZ, right? For each component, and everybody needs to see it. Even in the situation of this particular case, the project manager, when he brought me on, said, we need it to do XYZ. So when I went to the CRM vendor and said, we're missing this Z piece, and they go, that's not part of the scope. If that had been clearly defined, we could have gone back and said, okay, it is or is not part of the scope. Regardless of whether it was part of the scope or not, we needed it done. We needed it.
Yes.
It was like one of the key reasons for even building a new CRM. And so that would have been caught a lot sooner as well.
You're really saving yourself headaches as a vendor if you say, we want to know what we're supposed to get done, the phases and the deliverables that come with those. What are we delivering back to you? You want that clearly spelled out so that when you try to make the claim that wasn't in scope, because that's going to happen sometimes, you have something to fall back in and say, that is not what we agreed to. We would love to do that for you, by the way, but that it wasn't in the initial scope. And so let's revisit our agreement, maybe. Let's revisit some deliverables. Let's put an addendum on our engagement document, whatever you need to do to make that happen. Because as a vendor, you don't want to destroy your margin because you developed that based on what the original agreement was. And without those milestones, without having that defined early, even at a higher level, you're really setting yourself up for some bigger problems down the road. So key takeaways then are define milestones early, make sure those are tied to
Correct.
deliverables, and make sure that all of the tasks people are working on day to day tie back. They align with those milestones that tied to the deliverables.
I think the biggest takeaway for me from this project is that a little bit of work up front saves you a lot of time and headache and money on the back end. And I know that a lot of people think, like we mentioned earlier, let's just get started. There is a time where you can be doing too much and you're just spinning your wheels and you just need to get started. But if you haven't even tried to define what it is that you're needing, then you're not at that point yet. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to take the time. We only have 3 months. I don't want to take the time to get clear about what it is that we need. Let's just get started. But it ended up costing how much time fixing and reworking and of just twiddling your thumbs because you don't know what you're supposed to do next and you're waiting for
Yeah.
more information. You're hungry for more information on what to do next.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. Now, there may be someone who's listening to us, and we'd love to hear feedback. That's fine. Who disagrees with that part and says, no, we don't need to define stuff. We can just get going on things. There may be small, tiny cases or little projects where you might get away with that, but it's not going to be great if it's of any substance. You're just setting yourself up for problems.
Maybe I shouldn't say this as a blank general statement, but I find it hard to believe that there would be any circumstance where you wouldn't want to clearly define what you're wanting to do and that would work. At the end of the day, if you don't define your milestones, then you don't control execution, period.
So true. Great lesson from that. And I think this case was a great example of that. I'm glad you brought this to us and gave us a chance to discuss this a little bit. Let's take a minute to talk about, because shameless plug for the casework, SaaS application that we built that takes care of all this for you. It goes across the entire execution chain for your work. So if you're a vendor, you're a consultant, you have your own firm, even an advisory firm or whatever, in any interaction you're doing with a client, an engagement of some kind, the casework will help you from start to finish by helping you to build and keep track of your engagement document, even addendums to that, be able to send that out and get that clarity between you and your client. And then all the way from the agreement, right, to the milestones and the tasks and all the things that you would need to keep track of in your case, including your billable and non-billable time, your expenses, and invoices. We have an application that helps you to put all that stuff together. So all the things that we're going to talk about in these podcasts, the casework helps to solve.
It creates that transparency so everybody who's working on the project knows what's going on, knows what's next, knows what the objectives are, knows what is needed, and is able to then break that down into those tangible tasks that are being done day to day that actually move the project forward.
Yeah, it gives you the ability to keep everything that you need in one tool and allows you to give team members maybe different levels of visibility to different pieces of what's happening in a case. But the overall visibility, the agreement, the higher level milestones, all those things are visible across your team and really helps everybody to have that clarity of what needs to get done and work together as one team effectively trying to complete this work. Please leave some feedback or a comment if there's something that resonated with you or there's something you wanted to add. If you want to follow this full story of this particular case, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter on LinkedIn and also to our podcast. And we'd love to have you join us next time.
All right, that's the case for this week.
In our next episode, we'll work another engagement and break down the next layer of where execution started to slip and what should have been caught earlier.
If you're seeing versions of this work in your own work, you're not alone. Make sure you're subscribed to the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast so you don't miss what comes next.
And if you want the full written breakdown, you can find our Working the Case newsletter on LinkedIn, where we introduce and go deeper into each of these engagements.
So make sure you're subscribed there as well.
See you later.